So I just wanted to tell my personal story with Ms. Magazine as a woman of a certain age. I get to say that now. I'm very excited about it. I grew up with Ms. Magazine. I was a kid. My mom was actually an early subscriber, which I didn't know was weird until I got older. And I was always the first one home from school. So I got to bring in the mail. We got it in the mail. It was very exciting. And when Ms. came in the mail, it was a very good day. And I would sit home and I would read the stories, and I'd read the back page feature, and I'd read the letters. And then my mom would come home and I'd be like, Ms. came in today. It's so great. And it was something that we could share together. So Ms. has been in my life for 50 years, and I'm really proud of it. And I'm really proud that I could share with my mom, and I sort of feel like this book is something that we can all share. It's, if you haven't looked at it yet, it's kind of a scrapbook, it's kind of a history book, it's kind of a guidebook, it's kind of a picture book. It's also a really important time capsule, and it sort of documents where we've been and where we are and really where we can go. And it's also a celebration of how women with a vision can make things happen and can keep making things happen. And as Gloria Steinem said in the introduction, imagining is the first step to creating. So I'm so proud to be able to introduce our guest tonight. First, I'm going to introduce Michele Bratcher Goodwin. She is the executive producer of Ms. Studios, and she's the host of the popular Ms. podcast on issues with Michele Goodwin, and a frequent contributor. She's going to be our moderator this evening. Kathy Spillar is out there. Come on, Kathy. That's your cue. She's the executive editor of Ms. Magazine now, and the executive director of the Feminist Majority Foundation. And she served 4 terms as the president of the Los Angeles chapter of the National Organization for Women. Those are some good bona fides. Yeah,
woo, woo.
I'm liking that. Works for me. And Dorothy Roberts, who's here as well, is an author and the Distinguished Professor of Africana Studies, Law, and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, and is also a contributor to this book. I also, just before we get started, yay, Dorothy. I also want to recognize 2 other people that I know have contributed to the book that are in the audience. Those would be what we have now affectionately called the 2 Bonnies, Bonnie Thorntondale and Bonnie Stabile. Have I said that right? If you're, raise your hand. Okay. So these are 2 members of the Ms. family. But I suspect that there are a lot of us that are self-defined as part of the Ms. family. So if you feel like you're part of the Ms. family, can you raise your hand, please? Raise it high, raise it proud.
Woo, woo, woo. Yes.
All right. Glad to see that. All right. Ms. is part of all of us. Take it away, ladies.
Oh, thank you so very much for this very warm welcome on a September evening. I couldn't be more pleased than to be sitting here with Kathy and Dorothy as we celebrate Ms's 50th year anniversary and launch the book tour. And this evening, as you heard, you'll be hearing a little bit of audio towards the middle of our program and some Q&A. There's so much to cover here. We won't get through it all. Feel free to take all those photos, yes, and post them on your social media and all those places, right? Okay. I want to start off with Kathy, who is the editor of Ms. She edited this book, my copy right here, signed by Gloria Steinem just earlier this week on Monday. Yes, a shout out to Gloria. And Kathy, what was the impetus behind doing the book? The most obvious question, easy one.
50 years. But Ms. has played such an important role in our society and in the movement for women's equality that we couldn't let this landmark anniversary go by without really memorializing the work that has been done over the 50 years, the progress that we've made, some of the setbacks we've suffered, but we also wanted to pull together a representation of all the different kinds of issues that Ms. covered. And as you go through it, and it's organized by decade, you can see that Ms. was really prescient in so many ways. We were talking about LGBT rights and the fight of lesbian mothers to hold on to their children way before there was any understanding in this country of lesbian rights and the struggles that lesbian parents had. We were reporting on the Equal Rights Amendment literally from the year it was introduced and passed by Congress. And we're still reporting on, in great detail, behind the scenes, what's happening in the campaign to finally get it in the Constitution. We, in the very first issue, one of the most famous articles on abortion, it was a petition signed by 50 famous women. We have had abortions. And this was in 1972, before Roe versus Wade. So they were in effect admitting, many of them, that they had violated the law. And they were demanding the repeal of abortion laws that prohibited access. And of course, it was the next year that Roe versus Wade did come down. But the Washington Post even said a couple of years ago, looking back, they believed that that petition had changed the course of the abortion rights movement because it had made visible which until then which had been invisible, women who had had abortions. And so Ms. has had a very proud history.
You know,
very prominent.
Billie Jean King was amongst those women who signed that petition saying, yes, I've had an abortion.
That's right. Had a huge impact. And since then, we've had now amicus briefs in the Supreme Court filed with thousands of women attorneys who said that without abortion, their lives would have been very different. So we wanted to celebrate Ms. We wanted to celebrate the contributions Ms. made, this movement of which Ms. is a part, and we also wanted to offer a path forward because we're in a very, very difficult time, obviously. Rising authoritarianism, a backlash, women's rights are a key target. So we wanted to be sure that people left at the end of this book with hope for the fight forward, because I've got a lot more to say about that, but we can make this fight.
That's been such an important part of what we do at Ms., that expression of what comes next, the sort of glimmer of hope in times that can be so very dark. And as we walk through a bit of this history, it's really important, and I know, Dorothy, you'll be able to help us do so much of that. It's interesting, I've turned to a page that says how to write your own marriage contract. This is how far in advance Ms. was for women. You might want to put in your own terms in your marriage contract. But it brings to mind then, Dorothy, some of what this history was that Ms. was attempting to dismantle in some ways, right? So even in thinking about a marriage contract, I think about marital rape, for example, that had been legal in this country. Might you want to just touch a little bit on that? I mean, just the sort of history of what it means then to stand up and fight.
Well, marriage for most of human history, especially in Europe and the United States, was a form of bondage for women. Women had no rights once they became wives. They had fewer rights as wives than they did as single, unmarried women. And as soon as they became married, they were covered by their husbands. They couldn't enter into contracts at all. So for Ms. to assert that women should be able to write marriage contracts was a way of rebelling against the long history of women losing their right to contract when they were married. Yes. Marriage, of course, by that time, we had gotten past that history, but it still is part of the ideology of patriarchal marriage.
And notice that we hadn't gotten past domestic violence.
That's right. So that the exemptions for rape for husbands existed into the 1970s, and also the
North
way
Carolina,
in which,
the 1990s.
Well, yes, there are
some of those
exceptions
places.
as well. There are exceptions as well. It's even worse in some places. But it's also the way in which marriage had been a way of trapping women into domestic violence, into economic insecurity, and the ideology also that marriage should be a substitute for women's economic security. That has been the case in some ways. It's still the case now. It's coming back. And so if you think about the welfare restructuring law that was passed in 1996, that in that law, Congress asserted that impoverished women should be relying on marriage. And we have to bring into this also the racism behind all of this. This is something I so appreciate that Ms. Magazine has always paid attention to from the start, the inclusion of authors of color, especially Black women from the very beginning, and the issues of intersectional oppression based on gender, sexual orientation, as well as race and other types of hierarchies.
So I want to, given the door that you've opened up even more in terms of marriage, economics, and there are letters to the editor in here, including letters written by men saying, I don't like this magazine. And quite honestly, I don't want my wife reading this magazine. There's one letter in here where there's someone who's saying that, he doesn't want his wife reading it, his daughter's reading it. He doesn't want his wife working. And in fact, he knows at any given point of the day where his wife is.
And no feminists are allowed in the household.
Yes.
They cannot have feminist friends. And he will not even stop at a gas station if it's a woman who's filling up the car. And that letter was published. And the great thing about letters to Ms. is people wrote all the time. And so there was this dialogue going on between this man and Ms. readers for quite some time. And with some of the readers saying, the Spillar family deeply regrets the loss of Mr. So-and-so's mind. And one woman said, I think we've discovered the link between Neanderthals and modern humans. The letters are priceless.
They are. And the letters are profound. It's sort of getting back to a space where women can articulate some of the most important issues to their lives and also the painful ones. So on page 74, and this I suppose would be a trigger warning, but in the pages of Ms. I am 15 years old, and last summer I was raped by the closest friend of my boyfriend. I did not consider it rape at the time because I knew the guy relatively well, and I didn't think you were raped by your, quote, friends. I felt like a whore and a piece of trash, but worse than that, I felt used. I felt that I had done something to make him want to have sex with me. After school started, a woman from WRA, Women Organized Against Rape, came and spoke to my class about rape. I realized that women can be raped by anybody. Friends, neighbors, strangers, whatever. And if a woman is unwilling to commit the act, then it is rape, even if it's her husband. Although I still felt I had no one to turn to, at least I had a name for my hurt and some place to direct it and my anger. February 24th, 1976.
That letter and others like it prompted Ms. At the time, it was an extraordinary research project to survey women in colleges and universities across the country, and to actually the term date rape. Mm-hmm. There were responses to these surveys very much like this. Young women who did not realize that is what had happened to them, and so Ms. did the very first survey, this very first study on date rape, and I think interviewed over 3,000 young women on colleges and universities across the country. So that's the kind of groundbreaking work that Ms. did to define the issues, to name the issues, to name the problems that had gone unnamed for so long.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that at that time, most courts were still defining rape as something that a stranger has to do to the victim and survivor. And also the idea that there had to be resistance to it. So when you say, Kathy, that many women didn't even realize that it was rape, part of that is because of the ideology around rape, which for so long has been the idea that some women are protected by the law and others aren't, and also that some men are entitled to forced sexual encounters and others aren't. And so this was really, by printing her letter and also doing that survey, it was a major challenge to the dominant view of what constitutes rape at the time. And of course, we're still fighting that today.
Stigmatization against girls too. I mean, because
Yes.
there's also, the oh my gosh. Well, I was just thinking, sort of the locker room talk, what boys get to do, but what girls don't get to do. And that stigma still existing, but in the 1970s, it's huge.
Very powerful. And no recognition that men and boys could be raped.
Right.
And,
True, too.
and
Right.
right. So
And
all
Ms.
of
put that on
yeah.
the table as well.
That's right. That's right.
And, Dorothy, to the point that you were making in terms of Ms. being path-breaking because it was so bold in having Black women a part of it. I mean, look, to put that in context, there are folks just within the last couple of years saying, Vogue, there's a Black woman on the cover. And there was Ms. 50 years ago, right? Black women on the cover, in the covers, writing, editing within the magazine. I don't know that people really understand just how profound that is.
In fact, Gloria tells the story, Gloria Steinem tells a story that when they wanted to put a Black woman on the cover, they were advised they couldn't because the bookstores and the newsstands would not carry the magazine. And in fact, newsstands in the South canceled the magazine and would not carry it and would not put it out.
Let's just pause on that. I sometimes do that on a podcast. Just pause on that, just so that we really understand what that is, because sometimes things just fly by us. But to really think about, here's a collection of women who are saying, call me by my name. Don't presume I'm a Mrs. And I'm 30, 40 years old and don't call me Miss. Call me Ms. A group of women who then say, no, we want Black women on the cover. We demand and we will have Black women writing and editing in this. And then hear from people who say, well, then we just won't sell your magazine, and then ban the magazine.
Ms. fought those fights its entire history. They also said you can't write about lesbians. And as Gloria always says, well, then we had to. So Ms. has truly made an effort every step of the way to make sure that all women could see themselves in this magazine, and that all women's lives were discussed and reported on and talked about, because we all face discrimination on the basis of our sex. And it's actually, a principle of Ms. has been always to show that sexism and racism is universal and is intertwined.
Yeah.
So this brings me to a couple of things, right? There's pain and there's pleasure. So Ms. has talked about, pain, as we've discussed with regard to rape and sexual assault and domestic violence. And even covering, quite famously, having an image of women who died while attempting self-managed abortion or back alley abortions. A famous photo, you'll find it on page, what is the page in here? It's I don't know that it's numbered. But you'll see it, it's early on, page 50, and Never Again is the image of Jerry Sorrentino, who was in a New Jersey, I believe it was New Jersey, hotel room, and had sought an illegal, what was criminalized at the time, abortion, and died while on top of a stack of sheets. And this image, it's a searing image, but this image to show just what was at stake at the time. And at the time, while that is taking shape and being published, at the same time, Ms. Magazine, in the very next issue, is promoting the ticket that might have been about Shirley Chisholm. Right. right? You know, I mean, that's just how, you know, far in advance as well, right? Like, there should be a woman who has a credible chance of holding the highest office in our nation, and a Black woman has the right face for it.
That's right. And the editors of Ms. were very politically involved. Were involved in her campaign, and Gloria writes about how her involvement in that campaign really changed her life, changed Gloria's life. Shirley Chisholm was such an extraordinary fighter for justice, for sex, against sex discrimination, against race discrimination. I think one of her more famous sayings is, if there's not a place for you at the table, bring a chair and pull it up. You're going to have to be at the table. And she was just extraordinary in so many ways, a big supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment from the very beginning. And Ms., I think, really did her proud on reporting on that campaign.
Well, you know, as one goes through the book, what's interesting is, you know, the tales of pain, but also of pleasure, which is also controversial as well when one thinks about women. So in the 1970s, Getting to Know Me, a primer on masturbation by Betty Dodson, August issue of 1974. And that strikes me as a very interesting thing about pleasure, because even still it's a bit taboo. For women to have pleasure with sex. And Dorothy, you actually write about how the reasons why women, particularly Black women's pregnancies, have been surveilled so much, and the reason why there has been a policing of Black women's bodies, and the criminalization of Black women during their pregnancy, and the stereotypes of the bad mother, is because Black women aren't supposed to have pleasure and also enjoy sex.
That's right. Well, the key stereotype about Black women that began during the slavery era is that Black women are sexually licentious, innately so, and so are therefore unrapeable. And that stereotype supported the law, which was that Black women couldn't consent or not consent to anything, including sex. And so, of course, there was rampant sexual assaults by white enslavers of enslaved Black women, and to justify that, the stereotype of the licentious Jezebel began to be circulated. And so you have this icon of the sexually licentious Black woman who is unrapeable, that supports the devaluation of Black women's sexuality. And so in response to that, Black women are supposed to act as if they're not sexual beings. This is the impact of it is to be respectable as a Black woman. You shouldn't then be having pleasure from sex. So, this is the paradox of it. On the one hand, we're supposed to be innately licentious, but on the other hand, to be respectable. And one way of thinking about that is to think about the mammy, who was asexual. She was the Black woman who could be in a home taking care of white people's children.
Never taking care of her own.
Not her own. And so,
like she didn't have, somehow she seemed physically as if she had kids, right? Big bosomed and all of that,
yes.
But just big bosomed for white families.
Exactly. And that then supports the view that Black women's childbearing after slavery ended is devalued, is a problem, is a social problem, and that Black women should be deterred from having any children. So all of these stereotypes work together. And by the way, all of that is in
it's all in here.
Ms.
Yes.
So Kathy, you talked about the how advanced and prescient Ms. was in terms of abortion, but it was also prescient in terms of the criminalization of pregnancy, the punishment of impoverished mothers, Black, white, and of other groups, how poverty is punished, how social policy deters impoverished women from having children, and then how their pregnancies are devalued and criminalized and surveilled, which is completely entangled, which we can see so clearly today, with the punishment of abortion. In other words, it's all about regulating pregnancy and punishing women and other birthing people by controlling pregnancy, whether you want to terminate a pregnancy or you want to continue a pregnancy. It's all part of this surveillance and punishment.
To then pick up then, Kathy, on that prescience, right, of getting the narrative right and so close to reality while others are not. How does one manage through that as an editor? I mean, so in many ways, it's like Ms. waving a flag, but if nobody else is waving the flag, it could seem like, oh, the crazy feminist over there.
Well, and I'm sure I know throughout its history, Ms. has been characterized as those crazy feminists, always to be proven right eventually. And, we continue to do that. And make every effort that when we're writing about some of these ideas in Ms. and they're not getting covered in other popular media, that we do everything we can to influence other popular media. And we often find ourselves writing about issues, for example, most recently, doing so much work around the abortion pill and the networks that were developing even before the Dobbs decision to make sure that women had access, only to see the New York Times use one of our subjects that we had found and interviewed, telling her story about how she acquired the pills in a state that's a red state that had banned abortion. Only they contacted us and said we'd like to interview her too. Of course, they never credited Ms., but we are having an impact on the way other media is covering some of these issues, and we're very proud of that, and we're grateful because these issues need to be covered in a different way.
Okay, but let's also be clear, right? So on one hand, you have feminist media that's actually doing the work, that's being predictive, that's saying, look, this is what's about to come. I mean, in Ms. Magazine, look, we were having the conversations about Dobbs years before Dobbs. Yep. Kathy and I were sitting in the Feminist Majority Foundation office in Beverly Hills saying, okay, what's going to happen? Here it is, waving that flag. Ms. publishing stories like that, and only later then to see other major media saying, oh, we didn't see that. I mean, how do you deal with that as an editor?
Well, you just keep writing the stories. I mean, you keep getting people who have foresight because they're in the trenches. I mean, that's the thing that Ms. has that a lot of other publications don't have. Our writers are in the trenches. They know what's going on. They're part of this movement. Many of them are academics, like some of our guests tonight. They know what is happening before the New York Times or the Washington Post or anybody else even understands it's happening. And so we can write these ideas and report on these issues in Ms. We appear to be very prescient, but the truth is we're reporting what is happening within the movement, just that the regular media hasn't caught on to it. Right. That's the importance of feminist media.
Right, well, it also says something, you know, there's an economic aspect of that too, to be honest, because Ms. Magazine also decided that it would not take certain advertising dollars. And so on one hand, while telling the story, because you've got folks on the ground who are really, who really know what they're talking about, there's a cost that also one pays in a way to have a magazine that is also honorable to the people who read it.
Well, that's right. And, Ms. started out with advertising in its earliest days and could never make a real go of it because even when women were the major purchasers of goods and services, those goods and services would not advertise in Ms. I mean, it was all male executives, of course, making those decisions and the male advertising executives making the decisions. They just did not want to appear to be a woman's product that would somehow devalue that product. And so they just wouldn't advertise. And so Ms. finally gave it up. And we've kept that tradition. We are publishing now as the Feminist Majority Foundation, which is a nonprofit. And a lot of media, by the way, is converted to being nonprofit now because advertising is really, the internet changed all of that. But we also don't have to worry about what we say in Ms. is going to offend an advertiser. So it really frees you up in so many ways.
To say all that feminist stuff. Well, a couple years back, now we're in our third year, Ms. decided to expand some of what it was doing, including in the podcasting realm. And Ms. now has Ms. Studios, of which I'm the executive producer. Contained in our book here is an interview that I did with Dorothy Roberts about her book, Torn Apart, which is also a prescient book, which also goes back to Ms. carrying stories about what was really happening in women's lives. Yeah. And it makes me think this week about Rolling Stone, because this week, you all know the Rolling Stone story this week, right? You know, that women can't articulate in music, that Black people never articulated in music, right? But that actually made me think about something else that's part of the narrative of us here together, which is that in Rolling Stone magazine, so while Ms. was writing about women and work and women and pleasure and women deserving to be able to take care of their children with dignity and whatnot, the Rolling Stones published a piece that was anything but that, which got lots of attention about how Black children were going to be born, they were going to become super predators. That there was a brave new world of Black kids who would end up with doing such violence in their classroom, starting as little children. How Black babies being born, couldn't even look into the eyes of their mothers and things like that. And I couldn't help but think that, of the sort of doing this event this week and the Rolling Stone story, how different and apart they were.
Absolutely. So Ms. was publishing articles about how horrible the criminalization of pregnancy, the punishment of impoverished mothers, all of that was. I'm looking, even in 1972, there's an article by Johnny Tillman, Welfare is a Women's Issue, which is prescient in terms of the connections between welfare rights, supporting the caregiving that women do in their homes, that is valuable. And of course, Johnny Tillman, a Black woman a leader in the welfare rights movement, which also I want to highlight that Ms. was also publishing activist articles about what we could do to change society. Yeah. It wasn't just about how oppressive our society is, but what we could do to change it, the movements that were changing things. And so that is in stark contrast to what was going on, especially in the late 80s, 1990s. And I don't know when that article was published in Rolling Stone, probably around that time.
It was around the same time.
Exactly.
But
these stereotypes about, which has to do with the devaluation of Black women's childbearing, the idea of Black women passed down this depraved lifestyle, and then the crack baby
and
myth
all of that. But just sort of these broad differences. And what's interesting is that, again, to your point, Kathy, about, well, Ms. gets it right, and Ms. got it right because by the early 2000s, the New England Journal of Medicine and the Journal of the American Medical Association saying, we will never again publish articles that use the term crack mom because we know she doesn't exist. The New York Times 10 years ago doing a video apology because of what it was that they did. Meanwhile, there was Ms. years ago. What I want to do now before we go to audience Q&A is to just give you a bit of a taste of a podcast that we are launching with Dorothy Roberts. And where she is the podcast host. It's part of what we are doing at Ms. Studios. Part of the future of what we do is not only what we do in print, but also in audio and visual. And take a listen. So we're going to rig this just a little bit. I know nobody has heard this. You all are getting a special little taste of this, a preview before others.
When I tell this story, it's like reliving a nightmare all over again. It's like you can't even go to the park and visit with family. We were at the park that day because some family members had moved to a completely different state, and they came back, and we were all gathered around at the park. And, the kids were playing, the adults were talking, and my cousin was leaving to go to work, and my now middle son, because I have 3 kids, followed my cousin. And there was this Hispanic lady that picked my son up, and I don't see how she didn't see that my son looks just like me. And he's telling her, give me back to my mom, give me back to my mom.
This is Torn Apart, Abolishing Family Policing and Reimagining Child Welfare. I'm your host, Dorothy Roberts, a professor of Africana Studies, Law, and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, and the author of the book Torn Apart, How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World.
Dorothy, I want to just turn really briefly as we begin to close and open it up for Q&A. As part of the story that was beginning with that narrative is a woman who ends up hogtied and her shoulder dislocated after police come to her home for a spot check. In fact, the police are called by a social worker.
Right. Yeah, so that was Vanessa Peoples, a young mother in Aurora, Colorado, whose son wandered off just for a minute from her, and a stranger picked up her son and called the police on her. And when the police officer arrived, he ticketed her for child abuse because her son had strayed away. And so then when the social worker comes to the house to investigate, because now she's been accused of child abuse, the social worker called police officers for backup. And eventually 7 police officers came into her home. They threw her to the ground, hogtied her. They tied her hands behind her back and chained them to her ankles, dislocating her shoulder. And she ended up pleading guilty to reckless endangerment of a child, so to avoid jail time. But now she's on a child abuse registry. She was trained to be a nurse. She cannot get a job as a nurse. She's having trouble finding an apartment. And it's just one story that I tell in my book and on the podcast of how what's called a child welfare system can actually be and is more of a form of family policing that intervenes disproportionately in Black communities. Half of Black children in America will be subject to a child welfare investigation before they reach age 18. And many are taken from their families and put in a harmful foster system. And so my book and the podcast that I'm doing with Ms. Studios reveals all of that and calls for a radically different way of caring for children and supporting families, especially mothers who are struggling to take care of their children. Most children in foster care today are there for neglect, which is basically defined as poverty, not being able to meet the needs of children. And so all of these issues are very much tied together. And again, we're in the pages of Ms. From the very beginning, 50 years ago.
The book is so powerful.
Thank you, Kathy.
Yeah,
Thank
it's
you.
so extraordinary. You all must read it.
Yes.
It really is, because it's invisible to too many of us, what is happening. And as you said, I mean, what is an issue of poverty is classified in our system as abuse. And so instead of addressing the poverty issue, we are punishing the mothers who are struggling to make ends meet for those children.
Yes, and I'll say something very, very interesting and telling about the COVID lockdown. The COVID lockdown in New York City and other cities in America was basically a halt to family policing because caseworkers were not going out, and people predicted, oh, children are going to be abused in their homes. They'll be in the care of their mothers. This is terrible. Nobody watching over them. And in fact, there is absolutely no evidence that abuse went up. If anything, in New York City, it went down. And why is that? Because there was an outpouring of added income to impoverished families, which we know now cut childhood poverty in America, and is now rising again. Last year, twice the rate of childhood poverty because those checks were cut off, and also mutual aid networks sprung to action, and people were getting the concrete kinds of resources they need: food, clothing, different kinds of social services, which is what families need. We need to support caregiving and not punish people who are struggling to take care of their children.
Well, there's so much more for you to listen for with Dorothy Roberts' podcast, Torn Apart,
Thanks.
where the pages of her book come alive with the people that she interviewed for the book, who are interviewed in the podcast and telling their stories, which you can listen to. Just as a closing question, and we'll turn it over to the audience, Kathy, on the podcast on the issues, we always close with, what do you see as a silver lining? Where's the sort of source of hope? And there's a lot of source of hope within this book, too, because this book also talks about women rising and even concludes near the end with "we will win" and women winning. What do you see as a kind of silver lining that comes about with 50 years of Ms.?
I'm really glad you asked, because a number of people have said to me that have looked at the book and, is that we started with abortion, for example, and here we are again. And what are we going to do? We just keep fighting the same fights over and over again. But I have to say that this movement is so much bigger now than it was in 1972. In 1972, when Ms. started, we were a minority movement. Now we are a majority movement. We've just finished a new Ms. Feminist Majority Foundation poll that we're releasing on Tuesday. The majority of women in this country identify as feminists and self-identify. And some categories of men identify as feminists. That could never have been, that was not the case in 1972. We have now half of all law schools are women, and we have more and more women attorneys. We're not at 50% of partners yet, but you can now go out and get an attorney. In the early days,
That's a good
the
point.
women's rights movement they only had men attorneys that would take cases of suing law schools and universities for sex discrimination. Those were cases that were defending women's rights, but they were only male attorneys. We now are the doctors. We're business owners. We're athletes. Look what has happened with women athletes. So we're a popular movement. We're a more powerful movement. There's no going back. The Republicans are doing everything they can to push us back. They're not going to get away with this. They just aren't. Too many of us are educated. We have been off the farm. we know what's possible.
No more corralling, right?
But
sheepdogs can't do it.
But the fight, truly, it's an organized movement, and all of us have to be involved, and all of us have to do our part.
Thank you so much for that, Kathy. All right. Questions from the audience? There's a microphone right here.
When one looks at personal pronouns that people use, the term Ms. Probably doesn't come up that often anymore. It might be looked at as a little antiquated. Has the magazine thought of, over 50 years now, has it thought of maybe updating the term?
Not at all. I mean, it's critical that we're not identified by our marital status, just like men are not identified by their marital status. It's overcoming the coverture laws and all of the problems that marriage has presented over the years in terms of the legal status of women. So I think it's still very important. But I will say this about pronouns. Ms. was writing about pronouns in the 1970s, explaining that it used to be very proper English to refer to everybody as they. Or them, not he or she. And we're getting back to that now. So anyway, we won't change the name. It's important that people are able to find it.
Mm-hmm. Now, when Ms. Magazine was accepting advertising, there were cigarette brands targeted toward women like Virginia Slims, And what was the policy of the magazine for one thing, accepting the ads, or editorialize either pro or against?
Well, this was way before my tenure, but and the readership, by the way, rejected the ads. There were also alcohol ads. And that was one of the reasons, too, that Ms. ended up going ad-free. But it was, they were targeting women with cigarettes. They wanted to expand the market. Up until probably the 60s and 70s, smoking was really a male addiction, and they wanted to go after that female market. And so, what other way to do it but make it look like you're the modern woman if you're smoking cigarettes? So
and make it slim.
Exactly. So
maybe you'll get slim smoking the Virginia Slim.
But the real problem with advertising in Ms. is that the only products that really wanted to advertise were makeup products or diet products, and for their advertising, you had to editorialize about what's the best diet? How do you put on makeup? And it's the other reason Ms. couldn't sell ads.
Well, and there's also the other Ms. issue that was circulating around the same time, just before the magazine, which involved a Supreme Court case that involved a civil rights worker who was in the South, who was beaten up frequently and was being detained, I think it was in Alabama, and was being held in contempt of court because she was insisting that she be called by her right name. She happened to be a Black woman civil rights leader, and in Alabama, she just kept being called girl. And she kept insisting, you will call me by my name and you will use Miss in front of my name. Now, in that case, M-I-S-S. But the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court that Black women actually do deserve to be called as white women would be by their name.
Hi, good evening. As a woman who marched in 1980 for the ERA in Baltimore, what is the current status of the ERA? It's been in the news a little bit lately. And do you think we still need it?
Oh, we absolutely need it because we need stronger laws to fight sex discrimination, to fight violence against women, to regain abortion rights with an Equal Rights Amendment. We're not in the Constitution, which is why they could issue that decision in Dobbs and other decisions that have literally set us back. The Equal Rights Amendment is very much alive. It has been ratified.
38 states.
Yeah, I want everybody to leave here tonight knowing that it has been ratified. It's met the only two requirements the Constitution sets out for an amendment. Passage by 2/3 of both houses of Congress, which happened in 1972, and ratification by 3/4 of the state legislatures, which is 38 states. The 38th state was Virginia. It happened in early 2020. The reason it's not in the Constitution is the Trump Justice Department used the excuse of the time limit in the preamble to the ERA, not the actual ERA, but the preamble, to block the archivist from publishing it. We have resolutions now pending in both the House and the Senate that are modeled after the resolution that Congress passed to get the 14th Amendment into the Constitution. It says that notwithstanding the time limit and having been ratified by the required 3/4 of the states, it must be published in the Constitution. Those resolutions only have to pass by a simple majority of each house. Right now, we don't have a majority in the House, although I think if it ever made it to the floor, we'd see some converts quickly come on board. Those 18 or 20 Republicans that are in districts that Biden won really big, I think many of them would see the light and vote for the Equal Rights Amendment resolution. And in the Senate, we actually have 53 members of the Senate who support the Equal Rights Amendment resolution, but the filibuster kept it from getting to the floor. But there's a massive campaign being waged. And if you go to URL, it's sign4era.org. Join this effort. Show that millions of people are with us. We know it's a popular issue. The problem is we have opponents in the Senate and the House who won't let those resolutions pass. But we're going to do it, and we're not going to start over. We have an Equal Rights Amendment. It's been ratified. We're going to force this country to put it in the Constitution.
And I will say that there are efforts underway by Representatives Cori Bush and Ayanna Pressley. I was with them yesterday, and they are fierce in their fight for this and understanding just what this means for the most vulnerable of women especially, and particularly in this post-Dobbs reality, because when you think about it, as Justice Alito in the majority opinion in Dobbs said, well, just take these issues to the states. Well, we know what it's like when you just take some issues to the states. We were there in slavery and Jim Crow. And now in this era of Jane Crow, we see the difference between if you're a woman and you live in California or New York versus being a woman and living in Texas or Alabama. And what your reproductive freedoms and rights or just basic bodily autonomy and ability to get health care actually mean. And let me just say on that note, because it's on the minds of so many people, if we understand that a woman is 14 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than by having an abortion, then you know what the stakes are. And if you think there's any confusion about that, that's actually what the Supreme Court wrote in 2016 before the Supreme Court shifted with the appointments from the Trump administration. In a case, 2016, Whole Women's Health v. Hellerstedt, striking down 2 Texas laws, anti-abortion laws. It was the U.S. Supreme Court in a 5-3 decision when Scalia had passed away and Justice Kennedy was still on the court. And it was the court that said, we recognize that women are 14 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than by having an abortion in the United States. It was the court that said, we recognize that it's far more dangerous for a person to have a tonsillectomy than it is to have an abortion. So just so that we understand what the stakes actually happen to be. We want to thank you for having us. Oh, that's a question.
No.
Okay.
I'm just doing last call to see if there are any questions.
All right, yeah, because I was about to do the we want to thank you.
We want to thank you.
We want to thank you. I want to thank Dorothy Roberts for joining us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy Spillar, for all of your work and for editing this wonderful book. Really, do pick up a copy, take a look. There's such wonderful visuals in here. The colors just jump right out at you. The letters jump right out at you. All of this. It's a book that's for you, and also it's a book that should be given as a gift. So thank you all so much for coming out, and there are copies being signed tonight.